Okay, welcome everyone at the multi-networking community SIG meeting. Today is June 14th, and we are continuing our discussion on multi-network. Please add your agenda items if you have other topics to discuss. Put it in front of the discussion because it's going to take like the most of the rest of the meeting probably. I think Pete, did you add that one, or I'm not sure who added the first one?
Yeah, I added the first one. It's just really to flag that I put a section into the doc about DRA, how this fits together. I'm happy to discuss things in any order. The thing that I would like to do though is point that out to people and say there's a section there. Please, feedback's very welcome. I don't think it's completely coherent or that it hangs together yet, but I'm happy to talk through it. And if anyone's wants to comment on it and point out things I've got wrong, suggest things I could do better, that'd be great.
Yeah, I saw it as well. I started reading it through, but apologize, I haven't had a chance to kind of finish it yet. So yeah, I will try to get through it and read through it and give you some feedback on that. Yep.
I'm happy to give you a few minutes if you want, or I can just leave it. But I think the key thing is it does feel like DRA should work pretty well. And I think if we write the right kind of controller, we could save ourselves writing a lot of core Kubernetes code that maybe we don't need. And that would be great. Because DRA does
if you want to, yeah, we can
pieces.
do that if you want to. If you want me to share, or do you want to show
Yeah, if you
it?
could share the picture, and then I can talk through and then I can kind of talk through it from the doc, and then I can kind of talk through that.
Okay.
I think we could spend a lot of time going through lots of details, but I'll just try and summarize the key points that I think are important.
Can I give you just like 10 to 15 minutes? Is that enough?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I will.
I don't want to turn this into lots of bike shedding because there's lots of technical details here that aren't 100%, and it's better to discuss them offline. But
okay.
So let me start explaining. I think the key thing. Sorry, I'm fighting Zoom a little, which has decided to make itself really small, which isn't helpful. Give me a moment. There we go. Right. So a couple of things here. Firstly, there's a bit of a link here to all the different pieces here that there exist. So we've got pods. So we've got pods and pod networks. Pods are some kind of link to pod network. That's fairly uncontroversial. Pod networks have got some custom resource. And I've got in my mind a CNI implementation. So the custom resource would have some kind of network attachment definition type stuff in it in that case. The other case that exists now is that pods can have resource claims, which say, oh, I want to have a resource like this, which could be a GPU driver. In this case, the resource claim would correspond to, I want to be on this network. And then there are various links from that resource claim, which can point to custom resources and provide arbitrary parameters. So all of those things are provided by DRA. And the flow that I am thinking we could make work is you instantiate a pod. At the point where you create a pod, there's already some flows that say if you've got resource claim templates, go and add resource claims to the pod. We could extend that so that if you're attached to networks, we add a resource claim for each network with potentially custom resources. You might want to have the ability to put your own resource claim in there rather than having a resource claim template from the custom resource. That then gives you a couple of things. It gives you scheduling, because that resource claim can affect where the pod is scheduled. And because this is relatively arbitrary, it can do all kinds of arbitrary scheduling complexity. And it also gives you some interaction with the kubelet, because the kubelet has access to these fields. At the moment, it's just passing them across into a plugin. The minimal way of making this work would be that we write a driver. I'm going to say CNI again, because that's the way I'm thinking about things, that would the data that it would set up and the scheduling it would do would be very minimal. It would read the relevant resources from the custom resources. It would then put them into the data blob that is going to be passed to the plugin on the kubelet. When it gets the kubelet, that data is passed across. So no core changes yet. We've just written some drivers. The core changes to this would be, well, we need to have the pod network fields to actually set this stuff up. And there's some questions about how the resource claims go in there. And at the far end, we actually have to set the networks up on the node. But we've got the information into the node and have done the scheduling stuff, again, with what's already in DRA. So it feels like there is a path here where there's a number of things that are a little tricky, but it feels like there's a path that could make all this much easier. and do a bunch of the work for us. So we wouldn't have to write any scheduling code, for example. We'd be able to just reuse the scheduling logic from DRA, and we wouldn't have to write a bunch of logic to say, or we'd have to write much less logic, certainly much less core Kubernetes logic, to get parameters onto the node, because DRA allows you to, has got a path for doing that. There are a couple of open questions. I'm not going to go into the detail of the areas where I said, okay, this bit I don't really know about, but something like this could work. One of the more interesting points is DRA is problematic if your cluster needs to be functional before DRA is up and running. And because DRA requires you installing controllers, there's a kind of chicken and egg problem here. And the right answer for that is probably to say, well, you can have a simplified network where the default network would always be a simplified network that just doesn't use any of this. The way that that works is if you've got a simplified network, it doesn't use DRA at all. The only thing that gets down to the kubelet is you're on this network or you're off this network, and it's down to the kubelet to have some understanding of that, which I think for the default network is fine. It does mean that the default network would be very much different to other networks. And I think that's it for a summary. So promising, lots of details still to work out, and I'm very interested in feedback on what I've written here.
Just a quick question. In this picture, you provide both objects? You specify in the pod spec both objects?
I think the pod spec will have a link to pod network. The resource claim, I think we're going to have to be able to support it manually for complex use cases, but I think it is also better if it can be set up automatically for non-complex use cases. So the kind of thing.
What if your pod network becomes the resource? Because that's what I have in my mind all the time.
Sorry, becomes which resource? You mean the resource claim?
Pod network becomes the resource claim, yeah. Because the whole that's what kind of I would think in a long. So the special resource handling, let's say QoS, which is not on anywhere on the roadmap yet, but let's bear with me what I would imagine, right? Because the scheduler already, I see a path without any of this. What I'm saying is in scheduler, if I see in a pod spec pod network, I ask this special controller that we write for this purpose, basically, and then it does what you're saying about the cluster creation having the chicken egg issue. That goes away because we create that controller, the default, the reference controller for the default network, or very basic. It shouldn't be for default. It would do the basic thing that we do today, which would be just, okay, this network is available or not. And there is some way in this controller that can tell you this node has it or this node doesn't have it. So basically that is all there, and we leverage the whole code that DRA created. Pod and DRA code understands, oh, if it's pod network, I will go and ask this driver, which is hard coded because it's standard, right? So there is that one. And then the same way in kubelet, oh, it's a pod network. I'll just use the DRA path to pass this all arguments to you. This is what I'm
that if you have a controller that sets up the network, the controller can't work until the default network is working.
That part is yes, that part will be there because you always have to have KCM before you do anything. KCM has to work in that static pod usually. So, and this is where the controller would run, because this will be a default controller inside core Kubernetes. It will not be some, or maybe it would be, but then you would have to maybe start that guy some other way. So something to discuss. I'm not saying you might be right. Yep. There is something around that one. We can either include it in KCM and then that's a problem solved, and then we flag it whether you enable it or not, and you can start up your own, but then you have to deal with the chicken egg issue. And but still, what I'm saying is, I would not want to create a separate APIs, because this is very awkward what you're presenting. You have a reference pod network, but if you want to have additional resources and management for resources for that network, define the resource claim. This is very awkward. This is very clunky. I would not want that.
If you have a pod network, I mean, all I'm thinking is that if you have a pod network, you're going to have something that says what resources it needs. Now, you can have a default that says if you just have a pod network and no resource claim attached to the pod, then you have a controller that puts that resource claim in and says, you're on this network. I'm going to build a resource claim based on this.
or that.
think,
yeah, exactly. We
yeah.
could do something like that, and this is what I want to talk about, because I do want to talk about the like continue our discussion on the CAP, which was from the API point of view, was about the attachment to the pod, right? So
yeah.
At one point we can extend it so that either what you're saying, maybe that should be the case, right? Pod network, and maybe this will create the resource claim so that we don't have to do some special code under the hood. We just already have the resource claim, right? For it, and we create one per maybe interface per attachment to a pod, something along those lines, maybe, right? I would not want to. I don't like this arrow here, this guy. If this arrow were coming from pod network, that's fine. But if it goes from pod,
that
you
is
see the problem here, right?
That's a pod specific thing, though, right?
Of course, if you have a resource claim that's completely independent from networking, yeah, go ahead. This is like you want to use some, I don't know, FPGA, and it's not a network, and you do, or NVIDIA stuff, like graphics stuff, you want to share it and divide it in some ways.
One question.
Yeah, if I may make some comments. So the first thing is here that this arrow doesn't have to be something that the user needs to deal with themselves. Part in the document from Peter is a solution where we just have the whole API as you defined it, and then generating the resource claim is done under the hood. So the user doesn't interact with it. It doesn't, yeah. And that, I think that is indeed the preferred solution. So this by name and resource claims field is kind of outdated already. I think the actual proposal now is to generate that dynamically, and there is some ideas how to store that link in the pod status. So if users care, they can look it up, but they don't need to set this up themselves.
And
I think that addresses one of your concerns. The other comment that I would like to make is that if you do only one resource claim per pod network, you basically allocate resources for the entire network. And then you may get some limitations like this network is available on these nodes, but then your ability to influence pod scheduling is fairly limited. You can basically say any number of pods can run on this node using this network, but simulating things like a certain number of pods per node becomes tricky, and allocating additional hardware like an VirtIO thingy that becomes harder. That's why a per pod resource claim does make sense for, I guess, at least some drivers. Or some networks.
Patrick, won't that be treated as a additional condition for the scheduler? So I have a pod network which says, okay, which network, let's say it's disconnected in some ways. It can be, maybe it can be replaced, but basically the basic kind of scheduler, the controller for the scheduler will be saying just based on some flags, very basic flags on saying, okay, this network is available on this node. But then I'm gonna have another resource claim for that network because I want to do something like that, and that resource claim will have additional. This will be another round of scheduler because this guy is going to have some additional kind of controller or not. Or are you all saying that this pod networks, the array stuff, will go through this auto-created resource claim?
I think that's the idea. Yeah,
I think that's the idea. So, okay, I hear you. So yeah, let me read through that because yeah, that might be as well. Then, but then what will be the option for a user? You're right, because then you can only have one for that network, right? So then kind of you screwed if you want to have, I don't know, based on bandwidth, QoS, and some other pieces, right? Do you have to, like, for each parameter you have to have separate resource claim? Is that what it is, Patrick?
No, for each network you would have one resource claim, and
that's fine. But what I'm saying is, can one resource claim contain multiple parameters? Like
yes,
multiple...
of course. Yes.
Parameters. What I mean is gauging parameters. So basically, let's say my single resource claims have things like contain and look into things like, let's say, bandwidth and QoS.
So the resource claim uses the same concept that you have in your proposal. There is a reference to parameters, and those parameters are specific to that driver that handles the resource claim. So if there is one pod network type implemented by someone, they define which parameters they accept, and those parameters then need to get passed through to the resource claim, and then through the resource claim to the driver. And those parameters can be an arbitrary CRD with whatever fields make sense for that pod network.
Okay, but basically, I think it can be true because it's all up to your controller. So basically, what I'm getting at is, like today, let me maybe do a better analogy. I can request a CPU or a memory, right? Can a single resource claims gauge it all based on those two parameters at once?
Yes.
Or it's all that, okay, yeah, and because it's custom, your own controller, so basically, yeah, you're right, because then it can just see who has what resources and then list those, return those nodes that that kind of fits both conditions, right? So what I'm getting at is that it will boil down what sort of controller for the array we will create. What will be the default one, right? That will come out of the box, because I think with this one we will have to have one, right? And then there has to be ability for you to either point your pod network to a different controller for the array. Let's call it, I'm calling it the array controller. I'm not sure whether that's true or not, but let's say that is pod network can point to a different controller, the array controller, right? That will say, okay, now use this guy for this pod network because this guy is my own, and it includes stuff like QoS, bandwidth, and additional stuff that will kind of identify which network is available.
I think for the in-tree solution, we probably want to focus on the default network. And as Peter said, this is the one that needs to be usable right away. And it also needs to be very efficient, because you don't want to slow down pods that only use the default pod network.
Yeah.
So for that case, we probably don't want a resource claim to be created, because that implies that the scheduling becomes more complex, because the scheduler needs to ask the controller. And even if that part is very simple, it still implies this extra object that also might confuse users. So I think it would be useful to have the fast path for the default pod network somehow, and then have this extension mechanism where we support also pod networks that depend on a driver provided by some vendor. And it may be, and probably is, useful to think about how to have an example driver for such a network implemented either in Kubernetes or in some repo to validate this entire mechanisms, even if it doesn't do much beyond what the default network does. It would just be for testing purposes. And then that is then the solution that we pass on to vendors and say, here's how you can do it. Here's an example. Now implement your own custom hardware logic or whatever else parameters what you need using this new APIs.
So for that reason, I would maybe do, that's something that we need to think of. Whether we automatically create these resource claims or a pod network can reference one. And that will indicate which path I want to use, the more complex one or not. All right, I think I'm gonna cut it here. I don't want to kind of get into this let's read through this doc, everyone, and let's start commenting on this one, and let's kind of adjust on what we are discussing.
The one thing from that conversation that I think would be useful, which I think is what we're going on to next, is what the interface looks like to specify in the pod what you want from your pod network. And I think that's probably what we're about to talk about now. So if we can, if we get a picture on that, that'll inform the previous.
Yeah. So basically, just to and let's move to that. Okay. So to kind of resume to what we discussed last time, the first basic things, right? The pod pod spec changes. We are thinking of adding the pod network attachment, and that's a list of structures which will be the reference to a pod network name, optional name of the interface that you want to add to your attachment, and whether the specific network is a primary or not. So basically, primary means whether this guy is the default network or not inside the pod. So anyone had an idea of something's missing for them? I know that Multus has much more, like you can specify MAC address, IPs, static IPs. There are some bandwidth flags, I think. There is much more, but
So
keep in mind, this is something. Yeah, Tom?
I'd like to have some, how to say, additional informations areas such as the annotation or some stuff. It should be in the implementation specific parameters in the pod network attachment side. So maybe the user want to add. So let's imagine, yeah, you mentioned, the Multus have a way to adding the static IP or MAC address of this stuff. So maybe that this should be not in the pod network attachment object, but I suppose that this should be put in the additional information inside the pod network attachment. Like we have the string map, right? So they are using the string map. We could add in the some parameters. So I'm just proposing that we should
I hear you.
additional parameter here to adding the additional stuff.
A string of strings map is, I think, I'm not sure anyone would allow us. This is usually reserved just for labels. I'm not sure whether someone would allow us to just arbitrary parameters like that. That's kind of yeah, it is convenient because it handles everyone's case. But on the other hand, I'm not sure that will be okay, and I'm not sure whether we will be able to push that through in the API. Just maybe before we go there, what's kind of what information, what I was thinking, and I'm going to go to that. Let me just maybe close that one. The status. I want to kind of just point on this one. Just from the basic point of view. I hear you, Tomo. Let me just maybe just from the basics. So right now, what we are saying, we're gonna have the interface name, network, and what is the primary. Just for the sake
by
of
the way, I also have the question about the primary. So this
yeah, go ahead.
Design is expecting the one pod network should care about the IPv6 as well as IPv4. But sometimes some user wants to IPv4 using the Ether0. I mean, okay, okay. IPv4, the default network is used, but for IPv6 case, they want to use the data plan. At that time, how you explain the this stuff? At that time, the both data plan and the default network house the primary.
So you separate what you're saying, Tomo. You can separate the default gateway for v4 and v6.
Yes.
That's new. I never. Is that true? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So the IPv4 and IPv6 have a different gateway. I mean that
happens all the time.
Yeah.
So this then is that what we're looking for? Sounds like.
Yeah. Or maybe we need to have the like the array and the IPv4 or IPv6. I mean the primary, and then the primary is not a bool, and then maybe the kind of enum. We could have the string array, and then we could add in IPv4 and IPv6 or some.
No, that covers all the cases. There is no other way. This covers. There is no need to have other struct, right? So basically, otherwise I can do just this, right? Say that. So that covers all the cases. The thing here is in the list, this flag can be only in one element. It cannot be in two elements at once, right? So that validation will have to be there, but it can be only in one element of this list, right? This is a list, so only in one element. One of this can be just.
The default gateways, plural, are going to come from route advertisements in V6. You can do this all you want, but it's not going to, on a, maybe on a.
Michael, now you're
cloud.
going into, that's up to your implementation on how you do that. I agree with you.
It's up to RFC 80, whatever the hell it is.
No, it's up to implementation, because if they use the HCP or Slack, then I agree with you. But if not, then it's up to the implementation. And again, if your network uses Slack, I agree with you.
It's
you
not
don't have
nothing
any
to do with
control.
Slack. Slack is how you get an IP address. The routes come in IPv6 from route advertisements. If you are an industry standard compliant IPv6 implementation, period.
Sure, Michael. Let's. I'm pushing back on that because this is not my issue. This is not my. Let me just.
I'm understanding what the Mike is saying. So maybe but also I'm also understanding that you are thinking the different IPv6, right? So maybe in the CAP you should explain in this CAP IPv6 is a little bit different from the usual IPv6, such as we do not care about the router advertisement. We do not care about the link local or stuff to specify. Otherwise,
Tomo,
either may getting confused. I'm just adding.
It's not that, Tomo. It's up to the implementation. And Michael, let's sort that out in. This should be a separate CAP. If that's an issue in Kubernetes, I don't want multi-networking fixing that, because that's gonna be. This is a completely separate CAP. What you're saying is an issue today in default network today, and let's resolve it there, not here, please, because I think that's a separate CAP that has to be there to say the default gateway comes from the route advertisement, but Kubernetes does it differently. Let's resolve it as a separate CAP in the default network, not here, please, because that's I see what you're saying. I know what you mean, but I don't think multi-network should kind of resolve that, because that's something that needs to be resolved on the core component. Then we can inherit that. So maybe what we can do is, yes.
Should we build on the house of cards then?
I agree with you, but what can I tell you? I don't think we can resolve that, because as I said, that's completely different story. Resolving how the V6 should be done, it's not a multi-networking issue, it's V6 issue and how it's supported. I agree with you. We building then let's say we don't support V6. Is that what we should say then? I don't think so. That won't fly as well neither. So that's not. I think this is wrong forum on that V6 and how that should be held. I don't want to handle V6 and how it's handled in Kubernetes, because we want to just create multiple interfaces. I agree with you. We are building how what you're saying, house of cards, right? But
so one question, Maciej, not
yes.
related to IPv4 V6. So why we need a primary field?
Why we need a primary field? How do I know which network is supposed to be the primary? The default gateway.
The CNI conf list has it.
Yeah, that's your implementation, Michael. Let's put aside the implementation. I know that can be one of the implementation that can have it, but I don't use, let's say, CNI config. How do I tell which network to use as a default gateway?
So Kubernetes doesn't use CNI today?
It does, but not all implementations rely fully on CNI, Michael. Please, this is I'm trying to push back on CNI. That's the only go-to. This is not. It's not.
Aren't we saying that at the moment the default gateway is a parameter that's specified in the networks, as opposed to in the pods, and therefore that could continue? Is that not?
That's not it, Pete, because I can have multiple, so it will not cover the case where I want to have multiple networks per namespace. each then separate pod network will be primary for each of those namespaces. So I will have to configure every pod network as a primary because I want all of them to be primary in their respective namespace. So what you're saying, I cannot have one network saying that you're primary and the other one no, not, because then I can attach those two into my pod and then what? Okay,
so
that's the case we need to cover as well.
Yeah, I'm a bit concerned that we're worrying about this particular field, but there's presumably other fields that need to be passed on a per pod basis. What
do you have in mind?
So I don't know, but are we saying that the only things you would ever be able to pass to a network is the network interface name and whether it's the primary?
No, but I think this is the most generic across the board what we are trying to support. And I'm gonna throw at you SROV for DPDK. You don't have the name. You don't even have the primary at that point. Primary might be because your implementation might use the interface, but then it's up to your application, the PDK application, onto how you're gonna make sure that this interface is the default. So, and we want to support such case, right? That this network is all, let's say, DPDK type network, which you just pass around pointers to a PCI device, right? So this is an extreme case. An interface name already has no meaning here, but this is just an example. That's why I'm saying, if you will want to say, okay, I want to specify MAC address here. Someone's gonna say, oh, I'm not using Ethernet, I'm using something else. So let's add now InfiniBand stuff ID.
I don't know that these are mutually exclusive, right?
Mm-hmm.
Between like DPDK not having any of these, and then there's the other side of the equation, and I can tell you how often this happens because of how often I do see people do this, which is where, okay, so you have your definition, right? Your pod network object, and then you're going to attach to it, but you happen to have some like non sequitur type of pods that don't fit exactly that pod network, and you want to tweak something about them. I think is a fairly common use case, and it's just for the reality of how people's networks are, is there are exceptions. And just because some things like DPDK says, oh, all this stuff is like kind of optional, right? Like you nailed it. Like interface name is meaningless, right? MAC address is potentially meaningless or whatever because it's all handled on a different IP stack, right? However, if somebody does need to set something at runtime, you're creating a potentially just a paperwork problem for them, that you've got to have copies and copies and copies of these pod networks in order to reference all these different variants of them, when you could potentially have something to say like, hey, I need a static MAC address for this thing because it exists on a network that has port security or whatever, and I need to have one that matches what's already in that external equipment or something. So I do think that we need something to express that you may need some particular detail here. And yes, I realize CNI is implementation detail, but this is something that in the CNI world we handle with CNI args, right? So these are the
other things that you can pass around to handle that. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, let's
so the
Nathan,
not the so I mean
the grant demo.
Okay, so so not only the CNI, so the implementation specific you mentioned, but also the almost implementation would introduce the additional field for per pod basis. So I think so that not the specific data structure, but that we should provide some string map or some stuff. I mean that and then the implementation can consume this field whatever they want. maybe there's some implementation may adding the JSON in the string, it's okay. Some implementation may consume just a string, it's okay. So better for the annotation or like the annotation or some label, we should provide this stuff.
I'm not sure that's okay to provide a just simple string, the JSON into the pod spec. That's nobody's gonna like that, Tomo. I'm afraid.
So this is the implementation specific. I mean, from the apps from the Kubernetes point of view, we should provide the empty string field for implementations. I'm just talking. And then each implementation can consume this string field as they want to. So I'm not. So that at that time, we should not enforcing to the implementations to use this stuff. I mean that. So user can using the just Kubernetes just provide a string field, string map.
Nathan, you were saying.
I just wanted to second that. I think there is a use case, in my opinion, for some implementation specific metadata. If we are limited to passing the string, maybe an alternative to JSON would be a CRD reference of some sort.
Yeah, I was what if okay, before we go there, because I think we are moving to another topic. I think we didn't finish the primary discussion. I want to finalize that before. Before we go there, because I want to talk about the network interface that I am proposing, I was thinking initially to have, and maybe this answers all our questions and all the kind of concerns here. But before we go there, can we finalize on the primary? Tomo, you were saying.
I'm also have the different questions about the pod network attachment. So maybe if you want to conclude the primary.
Yeah, let's conclude on the primary. So is that something that I understand today we have only one network, so there is no other way to kind of split V4 and V6. But that's a fair point, right? We can have that. And putting aside, Michael, the case of that it's completely incorrect and the default gateway is coming from route advertisements. Should we not even worry about the primary 6? Should we just, because that has no meaning because it's coming from routing?
I'll argue primary 4 has no meaning. What's primary in the V4 case? What's primary mean? There's no default. What's the next hop gateway? Is it even Ethernet or emulating Ethernet? I mean, unless you put something to op, just saying it's primary is not going to help me.
Why not?
Where do you, if you're using a bridge interface, for example, what are you going to send to? I need an X-top.
Okay, so your network attachment definition will have the definition for that, won't it?
Why don't I just put all of it in the network attachment definition?
Then that's your choice as well, yes.
So is this primary optional?
It has to be defined for one. Right now, let me see.
I'll put it all in my CNI conf list.
It is optional, yes. But then you control, but keep in mind that you lose control of what's the default gateway. You lose control for it in this form. Then you have to make sure you attach the correct pod name to identify what is the default gateway. That's what you sign up for then.
Yeah, I do it all the time with Podman. Docker.
That's okay, that's fine. Yeah. So basically your name defines whichever, okay, I'm using this name, this network is the primary. So it's going to be the default gateway. That's what you are signing up for. That's what I want to avoid. I want the network to be more flexible. And it says, okay, here on this pod, you're going to be default, but on the other pod, you're not, because you're just a secondary. That's what I want to achieve to be network. Like in my implementation, I would want to have achieved that kind of flexibility.
I just have a problem with there's no such thing in IPv4 or V6 of a primary network. You have a route lookup for every prefix, and you will egress out of X, Y, or Z depending on that route lookup, some of which could be ECMP.
That's correct. But then you can define what 00 points to. And then the next hop is up to your implementation. And imagine you have an implementation where the next hop I'm going to bring up Google and our GCP. Our whole infrastructure under the hood doesn't rely on any of what you're saying, because we're using end-to-end and endpoint to endpoint. So basically, my next hop, okay, just make sure that a packet goes out of the node. The rest I will handle.
And that's implementation specific. I'll use the same
exactly. And yeah, that's what I'm getting.
I don't need.
So that's what I'm saying. And implementation specific, where at some point the gateway, and in your case, you need the gateway. So in your case, if you need the gateway,
No, I don't.
why not?
Not if it's point to point. I don't need a gateway. If I'm using /31s or /127s, I don't need any gateway.
That's what I'm getting at. That's what I'm saying. That's why this flag can be useful. But then if I need to, if I have /24, let's say, then I would imagine my parameters ref will contain such gateway. That's what I would achieve, whether I put
But
it in my
even then,
network
the
attachment.
gateway, you're one ICMP away from that gateway changing underneath you.
I'm confused. Why?
ICMP redirect.
This is before we're talking about?
Yes. And then if you're running with routing protocols, it even gets more,
No, I don't. Oh, okay. So why would I run that? Why would I run any routing protocols then?
Well,
I don't want to go that far. I want to keep it simple. And let's say I have simple L2 configuration.
Keeping things simple is how we got into this predicament in the first place with only one interface in a pod.
Then you want to push every single clustering to be more complicated. That's where.
No, I want to put it in the I want to put it in the conf list like people were doing today with things like Docker and Podman, among others, and then you pick the one that suits you.
Sure, but then you're tied. The single one is tied to be only the single one, or I need to create two version for the same network, because I want to, for depending on what I'm doing, I want one network to be the primary, the other one not. On the other case, that don't support my cases, or I have to create double versions of every network. One that has is the default, has the default set, and the other one where is not. That's what you're telling me.
That's not what I heard, but that Maciej,
no, but that's
my point earlier, which is, yeah, I'd like to reduce the amount that people have to change that base object for a detail about it. Is essentially what I'm saying. I know it's going backwards in the conversation, but to your point.
There's also the Linux aspect to it. You can set whatever you want here. If Linux already has a quote unquote default route in the container, it's going to ignore whatever you do anyway. Forget how it already has one. I'm not going to bore you with the details yet.
No, but then if your implementation handles and manages the pod namespace, how anything else can mess it up? Unless you use DHCP and you rely on some of those, and you pass everything, and basically you rely on external things for your pod management. Then that's I agree with you. Then I agree with you. You mess up with things, but if I'm not mistaken, like Calico doesn't do that. Cilium doesn't do that. Those are the two I know, the bigger ones that do not do that. Don't rely on external things to configure your pod's namespace because of what you're saying. There is no control over it then. But all those.
It's ironic because the telcos that use DHCP, just for an example, want complete control, or you don't get on their network. Period.
And that's a choice, right? I understand that, and there can be various ways on how to implement that, Michael. But I'm talking about like what is 90% of Kubernetes networking today. That's what they do. And I understand your case, and I understand your networking kind of approach. But this is like probably 5 or 10% of Kubernetes usage, and it's not doesn't cover the 90% that Kubernetes uses today. So I don't want to build a feature around.
Okay, so Maciej, yeah, your comment seems to be weird. I mean, so you're just focusing on the 90% of the Kubernetes users, right? So
not only I am representing because
if we're focusing on the major case of the Kubernetes, at that time that they do not using the multiple network, period.
Not exactly.
Right?
That's okay. Yeah, I said that now. Now I have to swallow that. But you're kind of right. But then what I'm getting at, I am trying to make this fit into today's standard of Kubernetes. I don't want to completely break the standard that Kubernetes has today, because that's what you're asking for. And I don't want to go there. Let's do that then in Kubernetes, in the standard network, because I want to do small
Hold
steps.
on. Hold
Yes.
on. Today, Kubernetes finds the very first CNI conflict, ASCII-Berkeley or whatever the term is, in etcd, in /etc CNI netd. So we're not breaking anybody.
That's fine, but that combination doesn't assume that whatever you do in the pod, what I want to say, no, and then it's up to that CNI on how you manage your pod inside. And now you want to push on the spec on the API, more of the kind of concepts of what that you have to kind of address all the dynamics as well, and do all the over there in the CNIs, and basically boil it down to the CNI conf, how it's being done. I know that's one of the approaches, and that's fair, and I agree with you. That's one of the approaches. Why cannot be both ways? Why cannot be flexible? I'm confused on that. Michael, you're muted if you're saying something.
Yeah, I'm just
thinking. Because now I agree with you, and that's fair. That's.
I mean, if you don't specify this at all, you do what we do today, so everything works. If you want to specify pod network name is the name of the conf list, and you could do the same thing specifying it.
Why can't we have both ways?
I just gave you both ways.
No, I missed that then. What do you mean?
If somebody wants to do what they do today, they don't have this object at all. They'll get the first conf list in like they do today.
Yeah, that's
true. If you
true,
want to specify it explicitly, the name of that conf list is pod network name in the object. It's the same. So, and if you want to specify a second one that isn't the same name that would have been found by default, today's default, you specify a different one, just like I do with Docker and Podman.
Okay, that's fine. And now how do I choose which one is the primary?
It's in the conf list.
And now, okay, that's in your case.
Like it is today.
No, I understand you. That's in your case, but in my case, it's not in the conf list. So how do I handle that?
Today, if this object doesn't exist, you find the first conf list in etc/etc CNI network D. Is it or is it not in that CNI plugins configuration?
In mine, it's not.
I would second that, and also in addition, we have in my case, I have use cases where you have pod A wanting one being the primary and pod B wanting the other one to be the primary. So either way.
Michael, I hear your case, and yes, it can be supported. Let's assume the primary doesn't have to be specified, and then which network is. I agree on that use case, and that's fair point, which I might have missed. The primary doesn't have to be specified, and the definition of what is the default is inside the pod network. That's fine. Let's have that. Let's have that case, and that covers your use case. But I want my use case to be covered as well. My CNI conf doesn't specify that the network is default. I want to explicitly say it through the pod network, and then through my parameters, because my parameters, when I'm referring to parameters, I'm referring to where was it? To these parameters, right? Those parameters specify how and how my default gateway is going to be handled. Whether it's for V6, if possible, whether it's for V4, and that's up to my implementation in my case. And I don't use conf lists. Okay, so how do I support that? I want you to support me as well then. Okay, so that's why I would want to have this primary field. And I agree with you. That's one feedback for what you're saying. This field, I think I mentioned that primary use of.
these things that in this document don't exist. So how's primary set today if it's not in the CNI conf list, if it's not part of like the IPM or whatever?
Michael, I'm trying to please.
I'm just trying to understand, so I mean.
But basically because it's done by, because my implementation doesn't leverage CNI at all. CNI is just a step to make sure that kubelet calls it and then follows up and calls it to a agent. And CNI has nothing to do today. Yes.
Mate,
So then what puts the default gateway in the pod if it's not CNI today? I don't do it, so because I use CNI, so I'm looking to educate me. I don't question, I ask enlightenment.
Okay, so that's what I was referring last. I think that was last meeting. Is I think Multus is working towards the same thing, where the CNI is just a stub, is just a proxy. Because you have to have of how the API is constructed, you create a binary in that path that you said. And in that stub, what it does, it will call into a socket, or there are some other ways, socket local on the node, and that binary knows it's hard-coded in that binary. And basically it calls to that socket, and that socket is part of an agent that runs as a pod in that node, as a daemon set across all the nodes, basically. So that's why it's available everywhere. And that daemon set has a full knowledge about Kubernetes API. And basically this is like another controller and a fully fledged pod, a Kubernetes pod that has the full knowledge about everything, has a privileged access. And what it needs only is the signal from that stub with all the, with basically just need the pod name and the namespace, and maybe the ID of the pod's namespace that kubelet created.
So this sounds like it's a CNI implementation specific solution, because it's not part of.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. Yes,
you can still do it. All right. So you want to flag to your specific CNI specific solution saying this one gets the default network.
It's not mine. You call it, it's mine, because I would say that the industry does that all the way. I think Multus moving there. I think Calico and Cilium does that. So I think it's not like my specific. You call it my specific, but keep in mind that's the standard.
Let's give a little bit of context for everyone else for what you're explaining, Mache, because now I'm trying to figure out what's the disconnect here. So in the today's Multus and CNI world and other CNI, there's a number of CNI plugins that work this day. We have an architecture that we call a thick plugin, which is essentially where your typical CNI plugin would be a thin plugin, which runs as a one shot. It's a binary on the host. It runs in one shot and away you go. Now, a thick plugin replaces that one shot with a shim that passes the information to a resident daemon that goes and does the rest of the work for you. So you can have like a little bit of a richer life cycle there. You've got something always resident in memory. It can have a little bit more state, right? That's not, to me at least, exclusive from what Mike is saying, because the way that operates today is by the same conf list that Mike is talking about, right? So at least the way that I understand it is Mike is saying, here's what we have today. What's our equivalent of that for the future? Mike, did I totally butcher that, or help me?
No. And that might account for why I'm confused about the need.
Yeah, and Michael, at that case, this thick CNI that Doug is mentioning has a full knowledge about Kubernetes. So imagine that agent, it just needs the name of the pod, and it can get all the data it needs from the API server, again, outside of whatever kubelet provided it to him. What it needs only is the ID of the namespace, because that's a hash that kubelet and basically passed to CNI. And this is something that is not anywhere publicly available. You can grab from API. So that's the information you definitely need from the CNI, right? I need to get the namespace, or the hash of the namespace, and then the agent looks at that namespace, it has privileged access to enter that namespace and do whatever it wants with it, right? And it can do it based on additionally on top of that, based on the Kubernetes API. So I grab my pod. Oh, the pod has those pod networks. I will grab the pod networks. What's in the pod networks? Oh, it has parameters. I will grab the parameters. It gets. I don't have to pass all that information through the CNI config. I just pull it from the API myself. I just need the references. And then based on that, my implementation knows what to do, and it can do whatever it wants. It set the default gateway, set all the routing, put the names on the interfaces. Sky's the limit, basically, at that point, right? So that's what I'm trying to kind of support as well, right? Your case is valid as well, and I agree with you, where I'm limited just the thin CNI, where the whole configuration and the whole logic is contained to the binary and has no access to the Kubernetes API, and everything what it needs is inside the conf list. That's valid use case. I agree with you. The primary in this case is completely unusable because it's over there. But then there are other cases where the thick CNI, where I don't care what's in the conflict. Conflict is just a stub, it's just a shim layer. Everything is, the whole logic is in the agent, and that agent has even full access to the Kubernetes API and grabs everything what it needs. So that's the two cases. Tomo, I catch you, go ahead.
So you mentioned, so Maciej, you as you mentioned, I feeling the how do I say, the this cap is forced to network implementators to choose the thick plugin, not the thin plugin.
Yeah, definitely.
So this means the current flannel is not working. No
the
longer.
current
flannel. Flannel.
The current flannel. I hear what you're saying. So what we would do, right? That's something that we can think of, right? Whether the current flannel would work.
Saying the flannel or other CNI like the primitive, the different CNI, which CNI, CNF, CNI community is providing. Kubernetes
maybe at that case it has to be what
period, right? It's not fair, I think. I mean that.
No, I agree with you. So maybe at that point, for those use cases, we use what Michael said. It's just the name of the conf list. They are named, and basically what Michael said, the pod network has to match to the CNI. If you don't specify anything, and that's what it can default to. Maybe we should look into that, right? How to support what you're saying. I agree with you. How we do that. We point to the CNI, and maybe that should be the default, and maybe this is where the vendor we would have to support from the get-go the default vendor provider. Basically it will be the CNI vendor, right? Basically the default CNI vendor, which we should maybe then implement.
CNI vendor, right? This is network provider, right? So this means, as you talked, this design, the pod network design is not the implementation specific. At that time, we are more thinking that not only the CNI, also the other something can be utilizing. So at that time, the pod network should have the how to say, not only the way to access the data, and also which the CAP should provide the way to passing the additional implementation specific parameters for each area, I think.
So okay, for the attachment itself, yeah.
So, by the way, the time is now.
Yeah, the time is up. Let's continue on this one next week. I think this is. I hope, Michael, that we managed to kind of at least found the common ground now. Because that was.
Yeah, I'm trying to understand.
Sure. So I think this is a fair point from you, Tomo, on how we would support that. Maybe that's something that we should look into and have a means to support the default, like the current conflict, because today it's just the first on the list. Maybe this can change that. And this is what Michael was saying. This name identifies the CNI conf list. And then the only thing that will distinct it will be we define a hard code, a specific provider that will just say, okay, just use the simple CNIs and the names, and those are the names for those. Maybe that can be it. And then there's no parameters, no nothing. You can expand them if you want to, but something to think about. All right, let's cut it here. I will add this as a continuation point for the next week. And if you have a chance, please read what Pete wrote about the DRA still, so we can continue next week as well. Thanks, everyone. Hear from you next week.
Yes.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.